Hello, welcome back to the studio. Today, another one of my paintings for beginners. This is a painting that I'm going to be teaching you step by step. I chose a nice reference photograph I took on a little field trip. There'll be some more of that later on in the video, but I particularly chose this video as a great beginner's painting because it really contains just maybe two elements. A tree, bushes, okay, tree, a little bit of grass as well. But there's nothing too challenging in this painting. It's something I think a beginner could start with and paint completely. Now, I have used a mixture of oils and acrylics on my painting. I did an underpainting in acrylic and then I did a highlighting layer in oils. But I think it's very easy to adapt and do the entire painting in acrylics if you wish to. So sit back and relax and watch this beginner's painting step-by-step tutorial. Happy painting, people!
So here's my canvas for today's painting, and as usual it's a 16 by 20 painted with grey gesso, or you can use acrylic. I took this photograph whilst out on a walk, and as you can see there is very little sky showing through, so I think my blue-grey colour for my background sky will be suited to this colour of canvas. But there's also a great deal of darks. Nice shadowy areas amongst the trees and some nice long shadows. So let's get started. The first step is an acrylic underpainting. And for this I'm going to use green. It doesn't really matter, whatever one you have to hand will work. I'm using green with a little bit of dark brown, again any colour you like, and a little bit of black gesso or acrylic. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. Also, some yellow. Again, I just use primary yellow. You don't need to be too careful. I also have a selection of brushes, quite old and bristly, and a few synthetic ones as well. And of course, my old favourite, the cast sponge. I'll show you how I made one of those in a video I'll link in the description. Let's establish the horizon line first. About a third up from the bottom of the canvas, and then I want to work out where these two big trees are. I'm going to move this one over to the 1/3 line on my painting. It's a bit of a classic. I start with my cast sponge, with a bit of black gesso or acrylic, and some of the green colour. Let's do a few exploratory taps first to get a bit of a feel for it. I'm going to mark out where the horizon line wants to be. As I mentioned, about a third up from the bottom of my canvas. I'll just tap on a rough line, just to remind me where to go. I'll fill this in a little more as the painting progresses. But let's drop in a suggestion of that big tree on the left. About a third in from the side of the canvas, and then the other tree a little closer to the right. But take care, don't let it go off the edge too much. I go back to my black and green mixture. I start tapping in some of the foliage. As you see from the reference photograph, there are two distinctly dark areas to the right and left. Nice little highlight through the centre. Use your reference photograph as inspiration, but don't get too tied up in it. Use it to your advantage, adding bits that you like and leaving out some of the elements you don't like, because it can be quite confusing. Now, using that same cast sponge, a little bit of yellow and green. I want to do some foreground blocking in. Not too bright, mind. I'm going to overpaint this with some oil highlights later, so I just want a fairly dark green tone at this stage, but something with a little bit of texture to it. As you see, the grassy area isn't completely flat, and the bright highlights in oils will show up against this dark green colour. My reference photograph shows that there are long dark shadows from the right hand side, so I'll do these in a darker green colour. Once again, slightly darker than I think they need to be, so I can add highlights in oils. Time to underpaint those big trees, and I want this brush for it. I mentioned brown paint, and it doesn't really matter what shade it is. I'm going to darken it with some of the black. I want to just block them in, Just make sure I get the rough size and proportion right for my painting. I don't know how old these trees are, but they're ancient and they're huge. So I make the trunks abnormally large. I'll add a few branches as well, but not many. They're mostly out the top of the scene. I'll add a nice gnarly looking trunk to it too. Now let's leave everything to dry for 30 minutes. My field trip takes me once again to a favourite walk through a local woodland, flanked either side by dense woodlands, smothered with wild camellias and rhododendrons, an absolute riot of colour. It's spring, and the birds are in full song, looking for a mate and a nest. Speaking of which, we find some new friends. We come across a little team of goslings, Canada geese, born this year. Listen to the little peeping sounds they make. They rustle their way along, searching for anything they can eat. I continue my walk along the lakeside because I know I'm heading towards a very special spot, looking for a couple of old friends. They've been waiting for me. In fact, they've been here probably several hundred years. And you should know by the thumbnail, I'm talking about a couple of trees. I don't know how old they are. I've tried to find out, but let's just say they've been here a very, very long time. And here they are, with the camellia for company. And I think I found my next painting project. Now it's oil painting time. I'm back from the field trip and my canvas is completely dry. Make sure about this. We don't want anything to be still wet. I'm going to be applying some Bob Ross liquid clear oil paint next. I've got some in a small airtight container and I've got a very old Bob Ross landscape brush to scrub it on with, one with the little orange tip. It's a sort of thin, runny, honey type liquid, but it needs to be worked into the canvas really well. If you can't get hold of any of that, you can use some artist grade linseed oil. It's a little thinner, so take care to blot off the excess. This is why you need to make sure your canvas is completely dry. You're going to be scrubbing this on there with a little bit of vigour. I'll add it to the entire canvas. I'll finish off with some long flat strokes. And while I'm doing this, check out this bottom right hand corner. I've put a light there to reflect onto the canvas. Notice no trails. This means I have a thin even coat. Last step, dry clean that 1-inch brush because I'm going to be using it again. Here's my palette onto which I've set some of my paints. I'll add some more later on, but the first colour I'm going to be using is some sap green. Just a small amount to start with. I'm going to be glazing my painting. The process of glazing is adding a thin transparent colour to a canvas. So you see here, some of the little grey spots that are left that I didn't fill in become green. It creates a whole new layer of depth in your painting. But don't cover everything up. I need some of those little bits of grey in the background for a sky. But what happens if you get a bit carried away and you fill it in completely? Well, luckily this is oil paint. It dries very slowly, which means repairs are easy. I pick up a little bit of paper towel and just carefully work out some of that semi-transparent green colour to reveal a little bit of my sky again. Just remember, don't go scrubbing at it too hard. We want to leave some of the liquid clear and colour on there. I next need to make an underpainting in oils. Some black, Prussian blue, a good amount of sap green. Mix this thoroughly. I want a lovely deep green forest colour. Quite cool, which is why I used blue. Here's that old 1-inch brush again. I take the brush and load it carefully with paint. I push into the paint and slide the brush up the palette, creates a little line in the colour, and it loads paint onto the very edge of the brush. Now watch carefully. I'm going to tip my brush slightly over onto one corner and underpaint the foliage with dark green. It fills in some of those little holes in the background, but more importantly, it adds texture. So a dark green texture is what I'm needing. And the reason why I need that? Well, because when I add highlights, they'll stick to a rough bumpy surface a lot easier. My first highlights will be with a fan brush. I've gone into a little bit of my dark green colour and a touch of my yellow tones. I think way back here, keep it nice and dark to start with. I'll tap in the suggestion of a little bit of foliage. If I need to add some more brightness to it, I can later on. It pays to start a little on the dark side. Adding a touch more cad yellow to my mixture, well, it makes those highlights really pop. Before I get much further with my painting, I think I need to add some highlights to the tree trunks. I take some brown and some black, a touch of white and a little bit of yellow ochre, and I make a marble mix. I'll take a small amount on my filbert brush, and I want to apply this to the right hand side of my tree trunk. There's a little light coming from the right hand side, and it just catches the edge of the trunk and makes it sort of glow. Notice how gently I hold this brush. It almost floats onto the canvas. The acrylic paint was applied rather thickly and has some texture to it. By just dragging my brush down the side, I'm trying to apply these little highlights. The trick is not to go over them too many times. They can start getting a bit blurry, almost muddy looking. So I changed my colours a little bit. I darkened it up and work on the left hand side of the tree trunk, but I think maybe just a touch too bright. I think I might have to calm that down, but I'll live with it for the time being and see how the rest of my painting looks. Sometimes it pays not to fix things before you really know they're broken, but I think too bright too soon in this case. After a quick stand back from the other side of the room, it's obvious these bright orange colours are just too strong. I'll take a little black and some brown and calm them down a touch. And there, an easy fix. Now, what about the other tree on the left hand side? I'll go easy this time with those highlights. Once again, just a delicate touch. Let the brush just float across the surface. Add a little highlight, stand back and add a little more here and there. I learned my lesson. Or did I?
That last clip was shot about a week ago. The UK went into one of its little hot spells, and quite frankly the studio became so warm that it was impossible for me to paint. My canvas was drying before I even managed to get any of the detail on here. So eventually I had to set my canvas aside for the week and wait for things to cool down a little. So as you see, my canvas is, well, just dried now, but it is just tacky. Now, a question I get asked a lot is what happens if I don't manage to finish my painting in time? Well, this is the same situation. Due to the weather, it got too warm, my canvas started drying out and I left it alone completely. The trick is to know when to restart. Well, this canvas is just tacky. And that's important because if it was still a bit too wet, then if I apply liquid clear back on top of it, then all the colour that's on there would be lifted off again. In effect, the new application of liquid clear would sort of re-energise the previous layers, and you can get yourself into a real pickle. All the colour that I put on there, the glaze colour, would start coming off again. All this detail through here would all start to lift. As happens, I think my canvas is just dry enough. If I wanted to put on some more liquid clear, I could do. Now, the trick is also to know, do you need to put on liquid clear? For instance, if I had to add more glazes of colour over this, I would definitely want something like liquid clear to enable those glazes to spread more easily. But if you only say had to do some details in the head, put on some grasses, you might think, well, I don't need liquid clear anymore. So it's up to you to decide. If you're doing glazes and lots of blending, then add liquid clear. Or if you're doing things with liquid white. But if you're just adding small details and retouches, then I wouldn't bother. As happens, I think I might add some liquid clear through this area because I want to add some different tones of colour through here maybe. Let's press on without painting.
So here's my pot of liquid clear again, and my old brush. I take just a small amount, and I begin very carefully. I'll just try a little bit here and there. Take it gently, just in case those colours start to lift. I don't want to ruin my painting at this stage. I'll take particular care with these two areas of my painting. They were the last parts that I touched before I had to stop painting. I think if I go carefully though, nothing will move. And again, just a thin, even coat is all I need. I also start with a fresh palette of colours because they dried out as well. Once again, dark sienna, touch of white. Just a little bit of highlighting colour for the tree trunks. Marble mix, of course, on a filbert brush. I want to add a little more colour to the right side of my tree. Bearing in mind, the light is coming from the right hand side, I want to see a little bit more of the bark texture on the tree. It may not necessarily show particularly well in the reference photograph, but there again, it's my world as Bob would say, and I paint what I like. And I like this a lot. But it seems as though I've gone a bit mad with those highlights on the left side again. I know, light can only come from one direction, but in the reference photograph it looked like there's a bright spot on the left side. I think in the end it was just a piece of bark that peeled off. Well, again, I'll come back and sort that out later. I want to now turn my attention to painting some grass. For this, I've got a nice fresh 1-inch brush, quite new. Notice how I pull my paints down. I want to create a curtain of colour to choose from. If I go to the left, it will be more Indian yellow. To the right, a little more sap green. Go right into the centre, some bright luminous yellowy green tones. This is for the area to the right side of my trees. This is where they're catching some light from the right hand side. Notice how I tip my brush slightly onto the right corner. You'll also notice that as I touch, I'm creating these bright yellow-green tips to my branches. Where's that coming from? Well, of course, it's coming from the corner of this brush. See, when I pushed into the paint, I picked up a little tiny dot of bright yellow-green. I've retapped my brush to calm it down. I think it looks a little bit less eye-catching now. I carry on adding one little branch at a time, letting my brush run out of colour, so that as I go from right to left, my colour starts to calm down, and I can paint the shadow foliage a little easier. This little tree branch looks like it's catching some light as it passes between the trees. I'll just paint the very tips of those branches. Once again, paint just one branch at a time. Don't get to fill it all in too quickly. As you see from the reference photograph, there's a few bright branches just popping in from the side, just covering the edge of the tree. Once again, I use just a very bright colour on the corner of my brush. A few touches, and that's it. It's done.
In the next section of this painting for beginners, I'm going to be using these. These are highlighting brushes which I made from old fan brushes. I just slipped them about a little bit. I think beginners will find these incredibly useful because they're quite small. They're not intimidating, but you can do this amazing detail. And it's very simple. If you want to know how to make one of these brushes, I'll leave a link to the video I made all about it down in the description. Now, sit back and relax and see how I paint these bushes and these little flowers in my painting.
Here's one of my specialist brushes I made from an old fan brush. I'll drop a link to the video in the description below. I take a little tiny touch of alizarin crimson and some white. I want to paint some camellias that were growing in the woodland. I want a variety of colours, from bright pink to pure alizarin crimson, so dark and shadowy colours. Using just the tip of that highlighting brush, I add just a few of the shadow colours first, almost pure alizarin crimson. These are little blooms that are hidden in the shadows. You see my reference photograph. There are many of them, but they're just not sort of standing out too brightly at this stage. I always like to try and put in some shadow colours first, and then pick out the real sparklers, the superstars of the painting, a little later on. As I work forwards in my paintings, I add a little bit more of the bright colours. A few touches here and there can make a huge difference to your painting, but you have to control what you do. I used to be guilty of adding all the bright colours to start with, standing back and thinking, that's a shame, I've lost all my shadows. But I can't resist adding a few little sparklers at this stage. Now I have two of my specialist highlighting brushes to play with. I'll put my little pink one to one side and switch to the clean one for some little yellow-green highlights into the Indian yellow cad yellow mixture. There are some little bushes at the foot of the tree, perfect for this little dagger brush. Just use the shape of it, touch the canvas, and create these lovely little sort of ferny branches. I think this is one of those brushes which I will find very useful in future. In fact, the more I use it, the more I like it. Once again, keep in mind where the light is coming from, strongly from the right. I'll add a few bright sparklers there, and as the brush runs out of colour, I'll do this little area to the left, in the shadows, with a darker green colour. And when I'm at it, I'll add a few little details in this shadowy area to the left of the tree. Very subtle at this stage, you can just barely see them. But I did say I'd add a few sparklers to the right hand side. A tiny touch more cadmium yellow into this mixture. Once again, really makes things stand out when you've got a nice dark background to paint against. I think this is a brush Bob would have enjoyed using, and I think it's one that you should have in your painting kit as well. It's time to turn our attention to painting the grass. Once again, I use my nice 1-inch brush for this, and I push into the paint with the full width of the brush, not just the corner. Using a little touch, touch, touch. Don't let the brush slide. You just want it to leave a little imprint of the bristles. Always working from the back to the foreground, so that way you don't go back over the painting. Although I do sometimes cheat, like here, and add a few little touches, but that's it. Work forward, leaving a little dark here and there. If you fill it up too much, it all looks a bit too sort of flat. If you look at the reference photograph, you'll notice that the grass is quite lumpy and bumpy. It is a woodland after all. Pay careful attention to the lay of the land. Leave a shadow here and there. Add a little highlight here and there. I work forwards in my painting. I leave that lovely deep shadow from the tree on the right hand side. I vary my colours a lot. And I also try and get a bit of a dappled light effect going just in here. It's because I didn't fill it too much too soon when I stood back. I created quite a nice pattern. I add a few darker touches of grass in the foreground, but not too bright. I want your eyes to be travelling to the back of the painting. Time to add another little bush to the tree on the right hand side. Whew, that looks very bright touch too much yellow there. But I won't worry about it. I'll tone my brush down a little bit with some sap green. Just touch these colours and move them around a little bit. If you enjoy my tutorials, don't forget, give me a little like. That's a thumbs up. You can even subscribe to my channel. It's all free. It doesn't cost a penny. If you subscribe, it lets YouTube know I'm doing something which you're enjoying. I stand back and think that the edge of this tree is a little bit bland. I'll put some foliage across it just to break it up, and it won't take much. Again, I'm just using my little highlighting dagger brush. A few touches of colour here makes all the difference. As long as you break that line, it's fine. I think I'm enjoying this brush a little too much. No such thing. It makes fabulous foliage. I can't wait any longer. I've taken my other little camellia brush and add these final little zingers to the background foliage. This is where I want you to be looking when you look at my painting. To the distance, across the grass, to this lovely group of flowers. It doesn't take much again. 1 or 2 little extra highlights make such a big difference. I want to sharpen up the edges of these shadows on the grass. I think this little green highlighting brush is what I'm going to use. I add a few here and there just to sort of sharpen things up a little bit. I don't want to change it too much. I don't want to lose all that lovely sort of texture I've got from the 1-inch brush. But sometimes you do need to just sort of tighten things up a little bit. A little more sparkle to those background areas as well. I'll make another little adjustment back there later on in the painting, which I think again makes all the difference. There's also some more little details to add here. If you look at the reference photograph, you'll notice there's lots of little flowers growing in the grass. I turn my brush on its side with a little bit of bright yellow-green colour. Just touch. With every touch, I add hundreds of little stems and stalks. I'll come back in a minute and add a few little flower heads as well. I stand back and decide I want my painting to be going somewhere, off the canvas. I've taken some of that bright yellow-green colour. I think I'll give my pathway, well, somewhere to be going. It's lovely to have a painting that takes you to somewhere. Where, it doesn't really matter. But it's somewhere for your eye to travel. It's important when you design your paintings, there's a focal point and somewhere to go off into the distance. And that's all it takes sometimes. Just a few touches of highlight. With that, I think we have a finished painting.
So there we have it. A beginner's step-by-step painting tutorial which you could do in oils or acrylics or a mixture of the two. If you've enjoyed watching this video, don't move because there's some more lovely videos coming along. I think they're actually going to be on this side. Happy painting, people! So, sit back and relax and let's watch this beginner's painting for beginners. Have I said beginners enough? It's a beginner's painting.